Hi, and welcome to Baiting Strategies. My name's Oliver Madge. I'm from an organisation, Pestwise, and I'm an independent tutor and industry consultant. Thank you also to BASF as part of this presentation, where we can talk about the use of rodenticides and how effective eradication campaigns can be put into play. As part of our problem-solving services, we come across quite a lot of issues where we find overuse of rodenticides, formulations on top of each other, baits being spilt. This is accessible in a cupboard, internally, externally, and I just thought I'd throw in a bit of a picture as to see how baiting stations in a very small space probably aren't doing the job that really we should be looking to do. So what are we going to look at as part of this? We have three key areas. The first one is the assessments. So we have our risk assessments, our cost, environmental. We're looking at efficacy, so the formulations and toxicity. So actually, what is the baits that we're looking to use? And then we have the techniques, so actually putting these on the ground. Now, I will say this is an overview of a session. It's a big subject to cover in the half hour or so that we have. So more discussions may be required around competence in terms of the strategies, and ongoing, I'm very happy to help. So let's start at the beginning. Risk assessments are by far, well, in accordance with the Health and Safety at Work Act, of course, the thing that we must do first. But this is based around actions and activities. It's not about the application of a pesticide or looking to control pests in any form. And really what we're talking about here is the working at heights. So the example in a loft, moving vehicles, trailing cables, slippery floors. As soon as we do consider applying a rodenticide, of course, we have a COSH assessment, equally under Health and Safety at Work Act. And we also then have our environmental assessment. So this is looking at non-target species. Now, we have a bit more work to do with these assessments, but the primary piece that we must remember is that all chemical pesticides are hazardous. So if they are hazardous, our job is to minimize the risk associated with using them. Now, let's just start with a few terms so that we can define exactly where we're going. Now, we have the target species, and this is the pest, obviously, that we intend to control. Now, in this presentation, we're mainly talking rats and mice. However, the same would be equally true for insects and insecticides. We have non-target species, and this is anything that isn't the target species. Now, gone are the collateral damage days where anything that ate the bait. Nowadays, it is only the target pest that's the key. We have our primary poisoning, and this is where an animal eats the product applied. And generally people, when we talk about primary poisoning, are concerned about larger non-target species, i.e. dogs in this case. Well, actually, we also then have to think about our smaller mammals, so our field mice and wood mice. And in this particular conversation, if we are just talking about rats and mice, squirrels, of course, are a non-target species. On our terms, we also have secondary poisoning, and this is where an animal eats the target animal, but it may also be a non-target animal that's come in and eaten it. And this is part of the food chain issues that we have, and probably our smaller mammals are the one that contribute greater in terms of this food chain element. When we talk about different rodenticides, they're not equal. So we have an acute rodenticide. These are known as single dose, not single feed, but single dose. Highly toxic, rapid death. Traditionally, they were difficult to use, but environmentally, actually, they're very beneficial. Now, we have alpha chlorulose for mouse control internally. Then we have aluminium phosphide, which now requires a level 2 and is external use for rat control. We then have subacutes. This is a relatively, I was going to say new process. We're actually reinventing some old processes, but with a new 21st century slant to them. And this mode of action doesn't affect the blood, and it isn't bioaccumulative. So actually the secondary poisoning risk is much lower, and we'll come back to that a bit later. But we then have our chronics, and these are all of the anticoagulants and everything that we have been using, certainly the last 30 or 40 years on that side. This is where they interrupt with the clotting process in the pest animal, which results in hemorrhaging. So we have our first generation, which are multi-feed baits. The active is coumatetraol. This is less persistent in body tissue, so it can be assumed of having a lower secondary poisoning. However, larger quantities need to be applied, and this could have an impact on our primary poisoning. We then have our multi-feeds for the second generation, so bromadiolone and difenicum. A multi-feed requires the rodents to repeatedly feed on the baits until they've consumed a lethal dose. We then have single feeds. This is our higher toxic products, and this is where the rodents need to consume less rodenticide in order to reach a lethal dose. Now, understanding these different classes of rodenticide is the basis of how you control rodents. Let's look at it in practical terms. And actually what this is really showing is a wonderful chart of the quantities it takes to kill a 250-gram rat. Now, this is biocidal products data. And if we start with our multi-feed first generation, so coumatetraol. Now, the Bayer safety data sheet has been updated since this chart was produced, and it now reflects 11 grams to lethal dose. Now, we then move on to our Second generation, so our bromadiolone, significantly less quantities. However, when we then start to talk about what's termed the single feed, so our flacumifens in this example, we're talking about potentially less than 2 grams to kill an adult male rat. Now, I should also point out here that difenacoum isn't included within this data, and that the standalone subacutes have only recently come onto the market, so they're not included within this chart. Just back to our terms for a second. Again, this allows us to really define exactly what we are going to apply and why. So we have a lethal dose, and this is the quantity required to start the process to death. The process, or this time to death, is from when that lethal dose is consumed to the actual point of death. Now, this will vary between rodenticide categories. Again, well, that's what we'll look at when we talk about the application techniques. We have toxicity, or LD50, and this is the amount of pesticide required to kill in a laboratory condition, and it's expressed in milligrams per kilogram. It's our measurement. We just know how strong something is or how toxic something is. We, of course, have our product label and our safety data sheets, and this is where we pick all the information that we need about application, dilution, if we were talking about insecticides, but importantly, what restrictions may be in place in terms of application, and of course, we also then understand our PPE that we need to wear. And then last but by no means least, we have formulations. And formulations are the physical appearance or the presentation of the product. And this is exactly what it looks like, and this is what we put down. Now, all rodenticides are ready to use, so there is no dilution required, and we don't add anything to them. So when we talk of formulations, we have our loose grain. We have our block. We then have our soft blocks. We have our edible gels. We've got our liquid. And of course, we have our contact formulations. And the advantage that we have with lots of formulations when we talk about safety is how can we apply them so that nothing else from a non-target point of view can gain access. So we come back to our COSH assessment. And actually, the whole point with a COSH assessment is about consideration of humans. So what are we talking about when we say consideration with humans? And it's really an accidental primary poisoning issue that we've got. So what is going to come across the baits that we apply that potentially could be consumed? Now, Bitrex should play a part in preventing ingestion. However, let's not rely on that as the safety feature. Applying a formulation that isn't visually appealing to children and not easily dragged by rats should be the objective. Now, when we talk about our formulations, what do we use? Because a block can be dragged, a grain can spill, edible gel, probably the best one. And this is the real question that we should ask ourselves is, what is the best formulation based on what we find? Now, it may be that we put it in a box. Now, that's safe, but does efficacy then come into play? Here we have an example where bait was put into a box. This is a wax block that was put into an external bait station, and you can see the hoarding nature of rats. They've gnawed the block apart and have removed it from the box. This image shows where the rats have actually dragged it away from the box. Distance between the box, where you can see the burrows on the right-hand side, and the breeze blocks where the second residues were found, is about 2 or 3 meters. Now, we've also got some burrows that have been created, and this could be a perfect opportunity to slightly change the baiting strategy away from a box and put it more directly. Again, product label allowed. So this brings into play our environmental assessment. Environmental assessment is consideration of non-target species. And this is where CREW very much comes into play. Now, this arguably is a bit more tricky to deliver effectively, but let's look at the basics. The environmental assessment should consider 2 points. You must think about primary poisoning, so what's going to eat the bait that you put down, and then secondary poisoning, what's going to eat the animal that ate the bait. Now, from a primary point of view, a lot of the conversations, as we say, is about dogs. Simply applying a multi-feed second generation because there is an antidote is not an effective control option during an environmental assessment. Dogs should simply not have access to any bait. But what about field mice? Because field mice will still quite happily live in external bait stations. So locking a bait in a box doesn't prevent that. How do songbirds then come into play? If the rats are going to drag and, as we saw in the image, leave it exposed, that becomes a primary poisoning issue. Now we switch to secondary poisoning, and this is what's going to eat the animal that ate the bait. So we have our predators. The risk that we have with predators is that they will catch dying rodents. They're easier because they're going through this death process, particularly with second generations. And of course, we then got our scavengers. So once the carcass is available, any food is a bonus. So we have our risk hierarchy, and this is where CREW have come into play, and they have really categorized how we should be looking to approach. But we have our non-chemical, non-lethal. So what opportunities are present within the environment that is bringing rats and mice to that space, or any pest? So we think of our proofing, we think of our cleaning, we think of our housekeeping, our stock rotation. We then need to consider our lethal and non-chemical options. So physical very much comes into play. And for rats and mice, we're obviously talking about traps, but it could be if we were thinking about insects. Heat obviously is a good example here. And of course, we then have our chemical options. This is where Crewe have helped define the structure that we should be looking to consider. However, Koch also supports this. So this is nothing new on that side. And actually, from a practical point of view, it might be that we apply chemicals first, control the problem, eradicate what's there, and then go back to the opportunities that present themselves and look for long-term management coming into play. And this is where I think we have a fourth assessment, but we could probably combine all these together in one larger one. But if we put this under the acronym of a pest, well, actually what's present? What species have we got? What numbers have we got? What size individuals? Because if we're going off body weight, that's a big impact in terms of how much bait we're going to put down. Of course, we have a big consideration for our non-targets, so we can incorporate our environmental assessment here. We need to think about the location where they're active. So what opportunities are present? Can we do this habitat modification? So now we're going down our non-chemical, non-lethal approach. We also have to think, of course, where they came from. Why are they there? Root cause analysis is a term that's coming through more and more. But actually, if we don't solve this problem of where they're coming from, we can get rid of the issue, but actually we're then just going to get more further down the line. And of course, finally, we then look at our treatment options. And this is where we consider our non-chemical, i.e. the physical side of things, or down into the chemical. And again, which are we going to use? First gen, second gen, multi-feed, single feeds, subacutes, chronic. All of these are part of this assessment process that we go through. And this is where we have defined it down into a simple step-by-step process. Now, going back to our formulations, we looked at it from a safety element. But ultimately, we still have to get rats and mice to eat the bait. If we make it so secure so that nothing can gain access to it, and we won't kill anything with a chemical. Now, the reason for having different formulations is probably the best comparison would be the game paper, scissors, stones. They all have advantages, and they've probably all got disadvantages. What we need to do is work through the best formulation at the best times. Now, of course, we must consider our non-target species. Now, if we have dogs, blocks probably aren't the best piece. If we had birds, blocks might be the best piece. They're less likely to peck at it, but they'll happily eat grain. We've got to think what alternate food is available. Now, soft blocks contain a lot of moisture. So if the alternative food source is dry, well, maybe introducing a moist, and certainly this is where the liquid baits come into play. Or should we apply baits that are similar to what they're currently eating? So it's much easier to transition from that food source onto our chemical food source. What are the rats prepared to eat? Now, this is the $100 question, because in many respects, we don't know in advance. And this is where applying one formulation actually removes the opportunity for rodents to eat. Give them 2 or 3, as long as it's the same active ingredient, because by giving them more variety, you have more opportunity for them to eat. We're not taking away that decision-making process. Of course, with burrow baiting, and you use loose grain because there's less likelihood of the rodents pushing it back up to the surface. But on application, it must go in the burrow in the first place, and of course then be covered over. And we have our safety element, which we must consider as well. And this is putting bait into box and then locking these TRBs. Now, is that the best application for efficacy, or are we talking safety? And what if the rats then drag bait out as we saw earlier? So we have lots of points to take into consideration, but all of this is done during our survey. Primary and secondary poisoning, our Koch elements, our risk hierarchy, which active ingredients we're going to use, which formulations we're going to think about, the time to death, resistance. There are lots of factors coming into play here. And actually every environment will probably create different sets of categories that we need to consider. But what about the pest risk? What about the risk to the buildings with these rodents walking around? I call it consequential risk, but what's the risk of you applying a rodenticide where it may take 2 or 3 days? Where will the rodents die? You know, that's something to think about, because we apply bait, leave site. It may be 3 or 4 days before this process even starts, let alone the week that it takes to conclude. And there's lots more factors to consider, but this is as an example of the factors to bring into play. Now, when we bring in the term IPM, this is my definition. Integrated pest management is a decision-making process in which a proactive approach is focused on a pest infestation or risk of a problem, and on the goal of providing the safest and most effective, economical, and sustained strategy. It's not just about bait. It has to incorporate bait. It has to incorporate the non-chemical, non-lethal. But when we do talk about rodenticides, it's not just about the one bait that you've got. It must be about variable factors. So how do we do this? Well, we carry out a survey, and that's where we collect all the facts, the information. We then got to assess. We should be breaking these down and working out where the risk comes into play. We need to plan. So what are we going to put? Where are we going to put? We then need to deliver it. This should be the most beneficial method based on the activity of the pest and the environment in which they are active. And we then monitor and maintain and obviously keep baits safe and secure. But actually, is it working? Because if it's not, stop, go back to the beginning of the strategy and just see if there's anything that's not quite right. Because ultimately, we have to get rats and mice to eat it or to walk through it with the contact formulations. One size does not fit all. And this is part of the strategy going forward of working out which product is the best at the right time. Because ultimately, it's the rodents that will tell you whether it's worked or not. If they don't eat it, if they don't die, it hasn't worked. So this is a very simple illustration where the lethal dose, I call it the piece of pie. But the piece of pie is how much bait we need to get in. Now that will vary between the actives, and also it will vary against alternate food source, where if they have a larger alternate, so a larger blue piece of pie, the likelihood is they'll eat less rodenticide. Therefore, it takes longer to get. Now, this is exactly where multi-feeds came into play. However, when we're talking about consuming rodenticides or through the contacts, ingesting, the objective must be getting that red piece of pie into the target pest as quickly as possible. Now, product label considerations, and of course, always we read the product label before applying, but we have some new terms that have come into play over the last couple of years. The first we have is in and around buildings. Now, in and around is basically defined as the building itself and the area around the building that needs to be treated. There is no definitive. It's where the rodents are active. If they're active outside and they are infesting the building, that would be in and around. If they're outside and they're not infesting a building, that would be considered open area. An open area is really defined as anywhere that's not in and around. Now, when we take our second generation multi-feeds, we can use them in both locations. When we take our single feed second generations, we can only use them in and around. So there are considerations that we need to come into play. What we use, when we use, where we use it, even how much of it we use, will all vary in the modern rodent control. Gone are the days of indoor, outdoor baiting and put it into a box and leave it there consistently. Permanent baiting is now coming in as part of this. We should be reviewing it. But don't forget, leave things static for too long, and actually the rodents will learn to overcome what we've put down. And actually, I believe that that site plans should be dynamic. They shouldn't be X marks the spot and the bait box has been here for the last 10 years because that's where it's always been. Actually, what we should be doing is rotating and moving, considering neophobia and possible avoidance. But the more we change, the more we give variety on site, I believe that's a much more effective strategy to overcome problems that we have. Now, applying rodenticides comes in three forms. So we've made, through our assessment, we've worked out which rodenticides. There is one final piece that we do need to consider, and that is our baiting technique. So we start with saturation baiting, probably the most common, certainly over the last 30 or 40 years that we have. And this is really where the multi-feeds come into play. We then have pulse baiting. And certainly this is a take on the acutes, but this is where we are looking at our single feed rodenticides. We have a new process that's come through with the launch of the subacutes, where we've now got a speed baiting technique. So saturation baiting in and around an open areas. So our first generations, our multi-feed from our second generations can be applied here. And taking the words from the great Adrian Mayer, it's essential that the rodents have ready access to the baits, and that they feed from them for anything up to 5 consecutive days or even longer. And this is the piece with multi-feed. They have to constantly be exposed. They have to constantly eat it in order to achieve this lethal dose. So what does that mean for a service point of view? You've got to return more frequently. You've got to keep the baits topped up. You've got to make sure that they are safe and secure, obviously. But if you let it run out, they will find, or they will go back to, their alternate food source. Now, a big problem that we have with saturation or with multi-feed baits across the UK, in pocketed areas, admittedly, is resistance. UK is probably one of the most resistant countries globally. And when we talk of resistance, what happens is it's a genetic mutation within the enzyme of the rodent that doesn't allow the anticoagulant to bond. Therefore, the blood clots still form. Now, there is a group called the Rodent Resistant Action Group. Now, here's just a very simple chart. You can see the first gen's resistance across the country. Now, that's not to say every rodent is resistant in every part of the country. However, tests have proved that probably more are than aren't. And you can even see into Hampshire with difenacum and bromadiolone, and even moving into Kent and Gloucestershire, actually the second generation multi-feeds aren't working. But what you will notice here is that the single feeds have no resistance. What we don't have are the acutes or subacutes. Now, these aren't included because there is no resistance. Put it into a map, and on the left-hand side, we have areas of the country that have been identified. If you live in an area that's not indicated as resistance, doesn't mean you don't have it. It just may not have been found. And the map on the right-hand side is house mice in London. Now, when we talk of more information, there is a process called tail testing, and I'm sure RAG would be very interested for anyone wanting to get more involved so that we can understand and paint a much clearer picture of what's going on around the country. So pulse baiting, the term that certainly was used in the acutes, but has moved on to single feed second gens. Now, unlike saturation baiting, large bait points are not used. You don't have to put as much bait down if you're going to use a pulse baiting strategy, and you don't have to keep them topped up. And this is where we highlighted with our pulse. Actually, it's decreasing quantities over a period of time. Where research is looking at this is actually saying that the dominancy elements coming into play reduces the population in waves. Now, going back to some research from 1982, it's believed that a single feed is required to produce a lethal result. So higher toxicity rodenticides are applied, however, in smaller quantities, and that's a really important piece. You don't use pulse baiting single feeds the same way as saturation multi-feeds. Again, to confirm, we've got our three higher toxic products are only in and around buildings. Now, when we bring that into a bit of a graph, this shows where the single feed element comes into play. So on a brown rat, could literally be less than 2 grams as part of its daily consumption. So it means if you have higher alternate food source, single feeds are probably the better product to be going for. Just to bring some trial data, you can see that on a farm with susceptible rats, i.e. they'll die from rodenticide, we're talking almost in a deployment of 25 kilos, control of 94% within 19 days. But look at the visits that should be done. As soon as we introduce a single feed, we're talking about less rodenticide being applied to that environment, less replenishment, and overall, look how much less bait is applied. A greater level of control is achieved. This is where dominancy may well come into play. So those lower in the hierarchy grabbing a quick meal actually will be controlled as well. But also we have less visits. And because we don't have to keep them topped up, we don't have to return as frequently. Now, search for dead and dying rodents is part of a product label, and that must be done in accordance with the risks that you find on site through your environmental assessment. Now, when we bring speed baiting, this is a relatively new term after the launch of subacutes. Now, Solantra, which is the only product on the market at the moment, and this speed baiting element comes in, allows you to reduce the number of site visits, possibly to as few as 3. Now, again, this would need to be in accordance with the site survey and population numbers and how much is deployed. But subacute speed of action, actually, it's the amount of bait required to control is 30% less than some anticoagulants. So if we're taking multi-feeds, we're reducing that with single feeds. Potentially, we're reducing this again if we're going to think about these subacute rodents. Now, the damage caused by rodents diminishes. So now we have our consequential risk, because what happens with speed baiting is the rodents actually don't move once they've achieved a lethal dose. Now, environmentally, this is very beneficial. If we take our multi-feeds and single feeds, they are both going to take 2 or 3 days to die after a lethal dose. They will still consume rodenticides, so potentially we have multiple lethal doses within a carcass. That doesn't occur with subacutes, and is an important element as part of our baiting strategy, particularly in high-risk environments. And of course, with all processes, time is money. So the quicker we can do it, the less product we can use, of course, has to be a much more beneficial financial position. So the subacute that we have, the active ingredient is cholecalciferol. It's been around for a while. However, it's not been around as a single active ingredient within a product. The lethal dose is slightly higher than the single feeds. The key is the stop feed technology. So they stop moving around once they've achieved this lethal dose. And that is really important from a brand recognition. So how your customers will then see this, as in they won't see rats walking around. Now, this term speed baiting, if we bring it into practical terms, where BASF are coming from is they're saying with rats, it's 7-2-7. So 7 blocks per baiting point, return after 2 days, just to make sure everything is suitable and sufficient. And then it should be 7 days later, actually the activity is controlled. And certainly the times I have used this product, we had control within 7 days. For mice, 2 blocks per baiting point, return 2 days, we should have control 2 days further. Now, Malice wrote a great book. It's the Handbook of Pest Control. And they've identified and they've cleared this really well. So we have a graph here. So population on the left-hand side, we have the number of days and the volume of rodenticide. So from a subacute baiting point of view, put the rodenticide in that needs to control the infestation. And within 7 days, we should be looking for population control. You compare this against saturation baiting, where the population, you have to apply more rodenticide for the same size population. But you have to leave it available. And it's flooding the environment. That's where this saturation element comes into play for the entire duration of the control process, because you never know which rats are going to come and eat at which particular stage. So you're applying a lot of rodenticide. And then we have this pulse baiting, or wave baiting as I prefer to call it, where we've got different sectors of the population coming out and feeding at different times. So again, you can see between strategy A and C, we're applying less rodenticide. So our environmental assessment from a primary non-target poisoning is reduced, even though we are using a higher toxic product. Now, this is a balance. There's no easy answer to say which you do and which you don't. It's all based on what you find, which is why the survey and the assessments are so key. Now, the application technique. So we've worked out what we're going to apply. We've worked out where, quantities. The next element is how we're going to apply it. And there seems to be a drive towards putting it into bait boxes. And we have our plastic ones. We've even got our metal ones. Actually, there's nothing wrong with cardboard boxes in the right locations. There's nothing wrong with open trays. And actually, if we look at some research study that was done, and this is from Buckle and Prescott, connected with Reading University, we have bait consumption from different baiting stations and a trial over 3 replicated sites. That was the volume consumed from open trays. Now, open trays outside is an obvious no, unless you can cover and protect and secure. Most of the time, we should be looking to put baits in voids. We should be looking to burrow bait. We should be putting it where the rats and the mice are living, not putting it into bait boxes. But you see the minimal consumption. Now, this is not easy to define in one slide. So we have a trade. Safety, absolutely, goes in a box. Well, unless, of course, the rats drag it out. But from an efficacy point of view, we really do have to be considering and giving them every opportunity to eat. Now, remember, the product label changes as well. So if we are going to use any tamper-resistant boxes, we need to put warning labels on the outside. But if we bring this into an office-based scenario, so we put bait in a box because that's the safe thing to do. But why are we not putting it where the rodents are active? Because we all know that the rodents are living underfloor, and then they come up through these opportunist gaps that they have within the floor space. Because if we bait within the voids, surely we can use a loose grain, because COSH is clear because no humans will gain access to it. Now, we could put warning signs in case a contractor came into play. We don't have non-target species in this area, and it may well be that even the rodents die underneath. And here's an example where we actually did put one of the rodenticides in an open tray in a completely secure environment, and the mice came along and ate it. Good old burrow baiting. Now make sure the burrows are active. Read the product label and make sure that we actually can apply rodenticides to these locations. And of course, a long-handled spoon allows the rodenticide to go in as far as possible. And certainly grain is always a preferred option because it's much harder for the rodents to expel it. And of course, we then plug it to make sure that non-target species can't go in. Now, really the idea that we're looking to do here, and here's a very simple example of a burrow system. Put the rodenticide as far as you can into the burrow system so that non-target species can't easily gain access. Now, whether you block it, whether you cover in some areas, and there is a debate on which is the best option, the principle is the entrance point is obstructed so non-target species, particularly birds, can't gain access to consume the rodenticide. So from a baiting strategy point of view, surveying, assessing, plan, delivering, monitoring, actually, there's lots of components within each of these parts. And I'm not trying to make this more complicated than it needs to, but actually it's not as simple as just turning up with a bucket of blocks and putting them for rats, mice, inside, outside, in a school, in a factory, in a restaurant. There's lots of information that needs to be collected in order to make that decision. Now, cost does come into play, of course it does. However, it's not just about the cost of bait. And if we look at this from an application point of view, if we consider the subacutes, well, actually, we're going to be putting less down, certainly compared to the multi-feeds. But the key is the number of visits. Now, single feed would require less rodenticide again, but we have to return more frequently. So which is more expensive, time or bait? And I would put money on the fact that it's time. Bait is cheap. It's always been cheap. I'm not saying this on behalf of the manufacturers, but actually, it's not the expensive component. If we're talking about a large infestation and we consider using a multi-feed rodenticide, we have to deploy lots of rodenticide based on saturation baiting. We've seen we have to return more frequently to make sure that it's topped up. Actually, this combined cost significantly outweighs single feed. And actually, when we even consider the higher cost of these subacutes, when we balance that against reduced time, it probably is a more cost-effective process. Now, this is exactly the same for cockroach gel baits. Read the product label, because the application rate is the one that helps determine the cost per unit. It's not the price that it initially costs. And that's a really important factor to consider. So there we go. I hope this whistle-stop tour of rodenticides has challenged you, has thrown some questions into play, has made you think. And I think that's the key starting point, is think about what we're doing, how we do it, where we do it, what we use, why do we use that? And if you do, I truly believe that your rodenticide skills, your professional service delivery will be greatly improved, and it may even save you money. Thanks for watching and listening to this presentation. I believe we're now going to a live Q&A, so if you do have any questions, please fire them through. We will be making more information available on this subject over the coming weeks, so please keep an eye on the website. Thanks again to BASF and to BPCA for these presentations, and speak to you soon.